Asyle, Tropical Island Survival. Week 36, Day 1. Okay, it's time to start working on Phase 2 of the dome, and I'm feeling the time crunch now. I've definitely overextended myself this time. In the morning, I gathered some likely-looking sand and spread it out in my molds, which were finally getting to see some action. Before I did, however, I got some lead scraps from my previous molds and even a few electrodes from the lead-acid batteries and spread them in the bottoms of the glass molds. I realized that, because the salt glaze on the insides of the molds was very similar to the glass I was trying to melt, there was a good chance that the sand would end up melding to the clay mold, making both of them worthless. The lead should act like grease in a cake pan and keep the glass from sticking to the molds. Glad I thought of this before putting them in the kiln, otherwise I might have ended up putting myself a couple of days behind. Once the molds were lined and loaded, I stacked them in the kiln with alternating layers of firewood between them before lighting them and leaving them to cook for the next hour or two. I went about the rest of my chores and stopped at the top of the hour to check on the glass. The first batch didn't quite melt as soon as I was hoping it would, probably because the sun wasn't at full power yet, but after that, they seemed to finish cooking on time, and when one batch of glass panels came out, another went in, the previous set of molds having had a chance to cool while the others cooked. Thanks to the lead and the polished salt glaze on the molds, the glass panels seemed to form for the most part without any major defects or sticking. After my morning chores, I started using the lime I'd stockpiled over the last 2 weeks to begin filling in the shell of the dome's foundation, as I can't start filling it until the shell is set. I spent the day mixing claycrete, filling in the foundation frame, and taking a break every hour to swap out the glass panels from the kiln. It didn't feel like as much work as I'd been doing in previous weeks, probably because I got to stand still for the most part while I was slinging claycrete, and it gave me time to regenerate before collecting the next batch of sand for the glass. By the end of the day, I had the shell finished. 2 weeks of work, all to do a job that otherwise took just 1 day. It really puts some perspective on how much work went into everything back home that you don't normally see. To you, making something with concrete takes only the effort to buy the concrete from the store, mix it, and pour it into the shape you want, when in reality, it took hundreds of people working for weeks to mine the limestone, process it in factories, design and build the factories, package the concrete, and ship it to the hardware store for your convenience. It makes me wonder if modern life is really as efficient on the whole as we tend to think it is, because there's a difference between efficiency and convenience. Perhaps convenience is just the illusion of efficiency, taken from just one perspective, your own. The only thing that truly eases the burden, however, is machines, because you can spend some time making them, but after that, they do the work for you, paying for themselves in the time you spent to make them 100-fold, as has been my experience on this island over and over again. Perhaps if I'd remembered that, I would have had a bit more time on my hands this month, rather than feeling rushed to get this dome finished, and my back and hands sore from transporting sand every day. Anyway, I got myself cleaned up and headed to bed after dinner. Week 36, Day 2. The concrete shell was mostly hardened by morning, so after my morning chores and getting the glass cooking again, I began the task of actually moving the dome out into the water. Felt kind of monumental. At the same time, this was also where the whole thing could just crack under its own weight. Even on rollers and rails, it was too heavy for me to push down the slope, so I prepared my track for it, even partly underwater, and tied the dome to the catamaran to use the power of the wind to help move the dome for me. I did so with great care, again to make sure the concrete wouldn't crack, distributing ropes across its surface as evenly as possible. But after a couple of hours, I managed to get it out into the ocean, where it bobbed up and down contentedly like a big concrete cork. It only needed to be about 10 or 20 feet from shore to avoid touching the bottom, but I anchored it with some heavy stones about 70 feet out from the shore, knowing that this was about how far out it would be to not touch the bottom when completely submerged. I didn't want to have to build a dock out that far though, so I had the idea to make it easy on myself by just using the catamaran as a short distance ferry, even getting some rope and pulleys to pull myself easily back and forth between the dome and the shore. I stopped for lunch at that point, but afterwards I could start working on sealing the dome up and filling the foundation. I decided to start on the fill mechanism first, chopping some bamboo into pipes and sealing them with latex. Because the solar tower hadn't been doing a lot in the way of water purification this month, I decided to use the pipes that were already there as part of my system to pump water at high speed and pressure down from the workshop to the dome. I just reversed the direction of the pumps and extended the pipe to reach the dome. The wind turbines would provide a little extra pressure, but I would need more, so I used some more rubberized sailcloth scraps to build a couple more diaphragm pumps, and used some hose to connect them to the reservoir and the pipes leading downhill. I then added some rollers to the sides of the water wheel to press on the pumps, since that seemed like the quickest and simplest way to do it, kind of like a peristaltic pump. Finally, I built a tall, conical frame with a bamboo T at the bottom. I lined the frame with some more of the sailcloth scraps to use as a hopper for the sand. It was starting to get dark by the time I had all that built, but I gave it a test and it seemed to be working. The pumps pushed water downhill, and the sand dripped down into the hopper, getting caught up in the stream and pushed into the foundation. I still have the problem of needing to fill the hopper manually, but it's a good start for now. Week 36, Day 3. After starting the kiln and doing my morning chores, I got back to the sand pump and spent an hour digging a big hole underneath it, the idea being that this would make it easier to load the hopper using gravity. All I had to do was build a big rake, and I could just drag sand into the hole to be shot into the foundation. This still didn't fix the manual loading problem, though. I just needed a way to automate the rake, and while I was working on it, I had an idea. I split another long bamboo stalk in half, hollowed it, and bent each side into a slight curve using a cord. I then jointed them to an axle I installed down the center of the hopper, and used some more of my spare sailcloth to put a couple of sails on the ends of the little troughs. They required some stabilizers to keep them from twisting the troughs, but they did cause the troughs to rotate around the axle, drawing sand in along a spiral path into the hopper. There was plenty of wind on the beach, but of course the sails only wanted to move in the direction of the wind, causing the torques they each generated to cancel out. So I tied the sails to a bit of cord between them, and ran that cord across a stationary pulley a little ways up the beach, such that the sails would be taut on the downhill side of the beach, but slack on the uphill side. This would allow the rake to turn in just one direction. A few rocks to weigh the rakes down into the sand completed the mechanism, and while this wasn't really going to load sand into the foundation too much faster than I could do by hand, the point was that it would free me up to do other things while it worked, and would run at night and on weekends, effectively halving the time I estimated it would take me to load the foundation by hand. I finished this system at about lunchtime, and while I ate, I thought about what I needed to do next with the dome. I really needed to get the furnishings in it before I started sealing it up with glass, and the ones that were going to take the most time related to the kitchen and bathroom. Specifically for the kitchen, I needed a new calorimeter stove, a distiller hat for it so I could distill salt water into fresh water, a mini pressure cooker so I could make more potassium superoxide if I needed to, along with miscellaneous vessels and utensils for cooking. For the bathroom, I needed a small reservoir for the water that would be produced by the distiller, along with a wash basin, another composting toilet, another shower head and hose, and tiles to line the bathroom with. For the workshop, I needed an electrolysis cell for producing pure oxygen for the superoxide, though I would have to vent the hydrogen into the ocean, a work table, some blades, and probably a pedal-powered mini-lathe and grind wheel. I can use the lathe as a sideways drill press if I need to. Finally, I needed planters for the garden, which would basically be raised beds that I should probably line with concrete or something to keep water or roots from getting out. I also thought to make a trough or something around the edge of the dome to collect the water that'll naturally condense on its surface, turning the whole thing into a natural distiller. And on that note, it occurred to me that I should plant several mangrove trees in the garden. They don't produce any particularly useful fruit or wood, but in addition to oxygen, they have one major advantage over the other plants, and that's their ability to drink salt water. Over time, fresh water will evaporate from their leaves via transpiration, which I won't have to replenish by distillation, basically making them a biological, solar-powered distilling apparatus. With all that in mind, I got started on building all the clay items for the dome first, as I figured they would take the longest to make, and I didn't have a lot of time. I had to make the stove in pieces small enough to fit in my kiln, so I could fire them later, so it was definitely smaller than most of the stoves I've built so far. That'll at least make it easier to lift into the dome. I made the distiller hat more like my tall fractionating column up on the solar tower, with extra spigots in case I needed to distill something specific from the materials I would have access to down there. I can always replace it with a pipe and let water vapor go straight up into whatever reservoir I prepare for it. The mini pressure cooker I designed, however, was a bit more complicated. It was basically a cylindrical bowl and lid, but I put some bamboo sticks in the top and bottom of them, radiating out like spokes. The idea is that, when it's time to cook with it, I'll use some cord to lash those spokes together, twisting them tight so they hold together under the pressure. Finally, I made some clay bowls, cups, plates, and utensils for cooking and eating with. As the day came to a close, I tried making them a little pretty, because it seems to help me relax, and it gave me the idea of maybe making a china cabinet for them later. I've never really cared about that sort of thing before, but now it seems like it would be a nice thing to have in the dome. Week 36, Day 4. When I got up in the morning to load the kiln, I checked on the sand pumping apparatus, and while it was still working nice and slow, it occurred to me that I couldn't let it fill the foundation completely until the glass was in place. Otherwise there would be no air pocket to counteract the weight of the foundation. So once the foundation sinks into the water to about 1 to 2 feet from the lip, I'll stop the filling machine. One more delay on this project. In addition to starting the kiln, I got about half of the clay parts I made yesterday cooking in the kitchen kiln. Another expenditure of wood. In the meantime, I got back to playing in the mud, preparing a large pot for the water reservoir, the wash basin, the composting toilet, and the shower parts, including some rubber hose and bamboo for piping everything together. At lunch, I pulled the stove parts out of the kitchen kiln and replaced them with the kitchenware from yesterday, and after lunch, I got started on making the tiles. I decided to make extra tiles that I could line the kitchen counters with, just to make the construction and cleanup that much easier. If the bathroom is about 5 by 5 by 8 feet, then it'll have a surface area of about 210 square feet, or about 2.5 batches of tile. Call it 3 so I have some extra. So I spent the early afternoon preparing them, making them in different colors to help liven up the inside of the dome, mostly white using ground seashells for color. After that, the only objects left that I really needed to make out of clay were the mini grindstone and the electrolysis cell for the workshop. This time I remembered to make the surface of the grindstone a bit grainier for greater effectiveness, and I exaggerated the design of the electrolysis cell lid a bit to better capture and funnel gases. I finished all my ceramic work by about the end of the day. Week 36, Day 5. In the morning, I started the kilns again and did my morning chores, and while I was out, I collected some more bamboo to start building the furnishings for the downstairs section of the dome. First, I carefully ferried the heavy clay stove parts aboard, which is not easy with a floating, wobbly platform underneath you. Once those were on board, I decided to start building the workbench first, so I wouldn't have to go back and forth to the workshop while I was building stuff in the dome. I built a simple table with bamboo slats to make it nice and flat, and then built the foot pedal and lathe mechanisms into it. I was almost done with it at about lunchtime, when I came in to use my existing lathe to trim the rollers for the bearings, and decided I might as well stop for lunch then. I unloaded the bathroom parts from the kitchen kiln at the time, and with them my mini grindstone to complete the workbench when I got back to work. A lathe is much easier and faster to build, 1, when you already know what you're doing, and 2, when you already have a lathe to help build some of the parts. Once that was done, I started processing some of the bamboo into a pair of corner hutches for the kitchen. One to hold the dishware I made the other day, and the other as the cooking station for the calorimeter stove, as that seemed to be the best spot for it that would also keep it in relatively close proximity to the bathroom for water production, as well as out of the way of the view. I then hollowed out some bamboo and lined it with latex for pipes, several of which I left as halves for the troughs that would collect condensation on the windows. However, I could only pipe the troughs on the upper level into the water reservoir. The ones for the lower level might as well connect to the garden, so I don't have to pump anything. At the end of the day, I varnished the furniture I'd made so far, and went to bed. Week 36, Day 6. I did my chores and loaded the kilns in the morning before collecting another round of bamboo and getting back to furnishing the dome, mostly building the raised beds for the gardens that would be inside. As mentioned, I left one of the beds in each garden open to the seawater below, so I could plant a mangrove tree in it. However, most of the raised beds I had to leave unfinished because I didn't have any more concrete to line them with. I'll have to do that later. Instead, after lunch, I worked on building another dining room set for the dome's kitchen. Again, it wasn't like I was going to have any guests, but for some reason, it felt right, and I enjoyed the process of building something relatively simple. At the end of the day, I varnished all the furniture I built and got ready for bed. Week 36, Day 7. It's Sabbath today, but with all that still needs to be done with the dome, and with the looming deadline of the smugglers coming back next week, I couldn't rest. The most rest I took after my morning chores was transcribing my Bible recordings. But even while I was listening to the sermon on the radio, I was busy cooking lime in the kitchen for lining my garden plots and grouting the tiles for the bathroom. I finished lining the gardens around noon, making sure to leave holes for the water condensation to leak into. And after lunch, I spent a couple of hours tiling, installing the toilet, shower, and wash basin when I was done. At the end of the day, I took most of the latex I'd stockpiled and fluffed it up to make another mattress for the bedroom upstairs, which I left to dry overnight, and spent the last spare hour of the evening watching the sunset and listening to music.
It's time for the blooper reel. It's a horror story in my mouth.
In the morning, I gathered some likely-looking sand, spread it out in my molds, which were finally getting to see some action, and stacked them in the kiln with alternating layers of firewood between them before lighting them and leaving them to cook for the next hour or so. I went about the rest of my chores and stopped at the top of the hour to check on the glass. I need to pause here because I realized a mistake I made. Alright, let's try that again. And stack them in... What was that? But they did cause the troughs to rotate. Wait, what? Lost my spot. A distiller hat for it so I could distill salt water into fresh water. I decided to make extra tiles that I could line the kitchen counters with. I decided hard to make these sounds when you got canker sores. After that, the only once that was done, week 36, day 6. No, not day 6, it's day 7. What am I talking about? I was busy cooking lime in the kitchen for my garden plots and for my garden plots and grouting the tiles for the bathroom. And grouting for the tiles of the bathroom. That's a typo. Hey there. Thanks for listening all the way to the end. Sorry about all the sand. I know it's coarse, rough, and irritating and has a tendency to get everywhere. Hopefully, most of it will stay in the foundation of the underwater dome where it belongs. However, in spite of all the progress I've made on it, and nice furnishings that I think even Captain Nemo might find a little impressive, I know the smugglers are going to be back any day now, and I haven't even finished installing all the windows to keep the water out. So, if you want to find out if I managed to finish the dome before the smugglers return to finish me, you can press the subscribe and bell buttons to get notified as soon as the next episode is ready, assuming I survive. That's also assuming, however, that someone else doesn't swing by to rescue me first by some miracle. So if you want to, it would help me out more than anything else if you could share this video with someone who you think would enjoy it, as each view increases the odds of someone seeing them who can help me escape. And since you enjoyed it enough to watch it this long, you can press the like button to say so, and to tell the algorithm to do a little bit of that sharing for you. Also, if you'd like to talk about some of your own stories and perspectives on the episode, maybe a time you worked on building a presumably less complicated bug-out shelter, or just found yourself having to rebuild your home base from the ground up a second time, feel free to share them in the comments section below. I genuinely love to hear them, and I'm always open to suggestions and corrections. That said, thanks again for listening, and hope to see you here again next week.